Charles Randell, chairman of the FCA, thinks pension freedoms were rushed through. Has that left us with a problem? In a recent speech, he alluded to the fact that the speed at which pension freedoms were introduced didn't leave time for modelling, testing, the creation of a set of circumstances to avoid poor decision making by individuals. In his speech, he alluded to the fact that £580 million has now been paid out in compensation to individuals who have, one way or another, exercised their rights under pension freedoms and then made, let's call it, ill-advised investments of one sort or another. To me, this is a systemic problem because the compensation essentially comes from all of us who buy financial products. It's paid out by the Financial Services Compensation Scheme, but the reality is that scheme is contributed to by all participants in financial services, and those costs are passed on to the consumer. So fundamentally, this is a tax on the prudent, bailing out the imprudent. You see, I think his heart's in the right place, which is evidently there is a problem here. £580 million worth of compensation would indicate that there is a problem. I don't think that the speed at which this particular policy was introduced is necessarily at the heart of this. Fundamentally, the way you choose to exercise pension freedoms is pretty binary. You either choose to take advice or you don't choose to take advice. That decision rests with the individual, and last time I checked, you cannot force people to take advice, even though in almost every case that would be the preferable course of action. This issue really stems from unrealistic expectation of investment return, and that's the politest way I can put this. The Financial Services Compensation Scheme essentially means that the regime of caveat emptor, buyer beware, no longer exists. That is absolutely at the heart of all retail financial services in this country, but it is particularly pertinent to pension freedoms. And if you can pursue unrealistic investment goals in the hope of inflated returns, let's call it get rich quick, knowing that if it all goes wrong, you're going to be bailed out, the chances are you're going to take that decision without necessarily the level of caution that you would otherwise exercise. You see, I think this problem really isn't about the speed at which this particular regime was introduced. The underpinning of all investment decisions by the Financial Services Compensation Scheme has effectively removed moral hazard from all decision making, and in many cases prompted people to act in a way that they otherwise wouldn't act if they knew the onus was on them and there was no, to put it in a cheap phrase, come back for them. I think the approach has to be more robust from the point of view of a decision-making trail. And by that I mean that there are clearly some checks and balances that need to be in place, and the responsibility, for instance, of pension providers to do due diligence on unregulated investments is evident, and I'm all in favour of that, and always have been. Nonetheless, once an individual has exercised their pension freedom, by definition they fall outside of the pensions regime because they've taken the money as cash. And therefore, I think in order to justify a claim for compensation, a much clearer paper trail of that process of decision making has to be followed, and there shouldn't be an assumption that that individual should automatically qualify for compensation. That isn't correct. I think they must be aware, and to me, a greater level of awareness at the point of exercising pension freedoms around potential scams and potential loss seems to be a much more sensible way forward. I think all of us have a responsibility to educate the consumer as to the pitfalls involved in unwise and often illegal investments, and clearly the government and the FCA are trying to do their bit. I mean, we all see the adverts on TV with a bloke running around on a jet ski thanks to somebody else's pension pot. So it's out there, but people will often be blinded by promises and often trust people who appear to be, on the face of it, credible, who simply aren't. And that has to be addressed by a regime where people understand that actions do have consequences. So, whilst we agree with Charles Randell that there is an issue here and it needs addressing, let's not let the speed of introduction around pension freedoms, which have brought a great deal of benefit to a great many people, let's not let the speed of introduction cloud the issue here. The issue is not with pension freedoms itself. That has been a successful policy. The issue remains the way that the public interact with financial services providers, and that still is unresolved.